The hustle and bustle of the coffee shop seemed like the perfect escape for a single mom like Tara. She'd worked a double shift at the diner the night before, her feet aching, her eyes heavy, but her spirit undeterred. Today, she allowed herself the small luxury, a cup of coffee and a moment to breathe before picking up her 6-year-old daughter from school. The faint aroma of roasted beans and the hum of quiet conversations surrounded her like a warm hug. She smiled softly as she pulled out her worn notebook, scribbling dreams and plans that kept her motivated. Across the room, however, a storm was brewing. Enter Meredith, well-dressed, with a sharp gaze and an air of entitlement that turned heads wherever she went. Her expensive handbag rested on the table beside her, a not-so-subtle indicator of her status. To Meredith, appearances meant everything. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Tara, whose modest outfit and tired demeanor made her an easy target. It began innocently enough, a loud sigh from Meredith when Tara accidentally bumped the table as she walked past. Tara quickly apologized, her cheeks flushing as she tried to move away, but Meredith wasn't interested in accepting apologies. Instead, she latched onto the moment like a predator spotting weakness. "Some people have no manners these days," Meredith muttered just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Heads turned, curiosity peaked, as the tension in the air became palpable. Tara hesitated, her instinct telling her to let it go, but the sting of Meredith's words was hard to ignore. She took a deep breath and turned back. "I said I'm sorry," Tara replied, her voice calm but firm. Meredith leaned back in her chair, smirking. "Sorry doesn't fix clumsiness. Or bad parenting, for that matter." That hit a nerve. Tara's jaw tightened as she fought to keep her composure. "Excuse me?" "Well," Meredith continued, her voice dripping with condescension, "it's obvious, isn't it? People who can't even carry themselves properly probably don't have the capacity to raise children right. I mean, look at you barely holding it together." A stunned silence fell over the coffee shop. Tara felt her cheeks burn with a mix of anger and humiliation. Her hands trembled as she clutched the notebook to her chest, but she refused to let the tears forming in her eyes spill over. What Meredith didn't realize was that Tara wasn't alone. A man sitting at a nearby table had been quietly observing the exchange. He wore a tailored suit, his briefcase resting at his feet, and his sharp eyes flicked between the two women. That man was Daniel, an accomplished lawyer and, unbeknownst to Meredith, someone who had a low tolerance for bullying. Daniel cleared his throat, standing up and walking toward the scene. His calm demeanor and professional presence commanded attention. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his tone polite yet firm. "I couldn't help but overhear." Tara looked up, startled by the sudden intervention, while Meredith seemed annoyed. "And who are you?" she asked, her voice laced with irritation. "I'm someone who believes in fairness and decency," Daniel replied, glancing at Tara before turning his full attention to Meredith. "And from what I've just witnessed, I'd say this conversation lacks both." Meredith scoffed, rolling her eyes. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually," Daniel said, his voice calm but with an edge, "when someone publicly humiliates another person without cause, it concerns everyone. And if you're willing to make such harsh accusations, you'd better be prepared to back them up." The room was silent, all eyes now on the unfolding drama. Tara's heart pounded as she realized she wasn't alone in facing Meredith's cruelty. But as Daniel locked eyes with Meredith, it became clear that the tables were about to turn and Meredith was entirely unprepared for what was coming next. Meredith crossed her arms, her confidence unwavering despite the growing tension. She gave Daniel a once-over, clearly unimpressed. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this has nothing to do with you. I was just pointing out the obvious." She cast another disdainful glance at Tara, her words sharper than necessary. "If she's embarrassed, that's not my fault." Tara wanted to sink into the floor, but something about Daniel's calm presence gave her a small flicker of courage. She stayed silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table as Daniel stepped closer, his expression unreadable but his tone measured. "Pointing out the obvious?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's clarify what's obvious here." "You've judged someone you don't know based entirely on assumptions." You've belittled a single mom who, from what I can tell, is doing her best. And you've made it everyone else's business by creating a scene." His voice softened, but his words carried weight. "So yes, this very much concerns me." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some customers tried to pretend they weren't watching, while others openly leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Meredith's face flushed slightly, though she quickly masked it with an icy laugh. "Are you her lawyer or something?" she asked mockingly, clearly intending the question as an insult. "Because if you are, she'd better find someone who's actually good at their job." "You don't scare me." Daniel didn't flinch. "As a matter of fact, I am a lawyer," he replied simply. "And if you want to make this about credentials, I'd be happy to oblige. But that's not really the point here, is it?" Meredith opened her mouth to respond but seemed to falter for a split second, clearly caught off guard by Daniel's calm confidence. Tara, meanwhile, felt a mix of emotions swirling within her: gratitude for Daniel's support, embarrassment for being the center of attention, and a simmering anger at Meredith's blatant cruelty. "Look," Meredith said, regaining her composure, "I don't have time for this. I was just making an observation. If she can't handle a little constructive criticism, that's not my problem." "Constructive criticism?" Daniel repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Is that what you call publicly humiliating someone for no reason? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot more like bullying." The word hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Meredith seemed to hesitate. Her confidence wavered just enough for Daniel to notice, and he pressed on. "I'd like to know what you gain from tearing someone down like this," he said, his tone still calm but laced with undeniable authority. "Does it make you feel better about yourself? Does it give you a sense of power? Or is it just easier to attack someone you think won't fight back?" Meredith glared at him, her jaw tightening. "You don't know anything about me," she snapped, her voice defensive now. "You're just jumping to conclusions." "Maybe I am," Daniel admitted, his eyes locking onto hers. "But isn't that exactly what you did to her?" He gestured toward Tara, whose eyes widened in surprise at being brought back into the conversation. "You saw someone you assumed was beneath you, and you decided that made it okay to judge her. But the truth is, you don't know anything about her, just like I don't know anything about you." For a moment, Meredith didn't respond. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Tara felt her throat tighten as she glanced around, noticing the curious stares of the other customers. She hated being the center of attention, but she also couldn't deny the strange sense of vindication building inside her as Daniel continued to stand his ground. Finally, Meredith straightened her shoulders, clearly determined not to let Daniel win. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," she said, her tone dismissive. "I don't owe anyone an explanation, least of all you." "That's where you're wrong," Daniel replied evenly. "You do owe her an explanation. And if you're unwilling to give her the basic decency of an apology, then maybe you're not as confident in your actions as you pretend to be." Tara's heart pounded as she looked between them, unsure of what to expect next. She wanted to say anything to defend herself, but the words felt stuck in her throat. All she could do was watch as Meredith and Daniel faced off, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line, her carefully crafted composure beginning to crack. She glanced around the room, clearly aware of the growing number of eyes on her, and for a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable. But just as quickly, she hardened again, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'm not apologizing," she said, her voice cold and final. "People need to learn how to take criticism. If she can't handle that, that's her problem, not mine." Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "It's not criticism if it's meant to hurt," he said quietly. "And I think, deep down, you know that." Before Meredith could respond, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke the tension. A young barista, who had been quietly watching from behind the counter, stepped forward hesitantly. Her face was flushed with nervousness, but there was a determined set to her jaw as she spoke. "Excuse me," the barista said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. I think you should leave." The room fell into stunned silence once again as all eyes turned to the barista. Meredith's eyes widened in disbelief, and Tara felt her breath catch in her throat. Daniel, however, smiled faintly, as if silently applauding the young woman's bravery. "Excuse me?" Meredith said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The barista squared her shoulders, meeting Meredith's gaze head-on. "I don't care who you are," she said firmly. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here. If you can't treat people with respect, then you're not welcome." Meredith's face turned an alarming shade of red, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might argue. But something in the barista's unwavering expression, or perhaps the weight of the room's collective judgment, made her pause. With a final glare at Tara and Daniel, she grabbed her handbag and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind her. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Tara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Daniel turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Tara nodded, though her voice wavered when she finally spoke. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Daniel said with a small smile. "No one deserves to be treated like that." The barista approached them, her cheeks still flushed but her expression kind. "I'm so sorry that happened," she said to Tara. "Are you sure you're okay?" Tara managed a small smile, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected kindness she'd received. "I think I will be," she said quietly. But as the three of them stood there, the echoes of Meredith's cruel words still lingering in the back of Tara's mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. The days following the coffee shop incident were a whirlwind for Tara. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it didn't matter what someone like Meredith thought of her. But as much as she tried to push the memory aside, the humiliation and judgment echoed in her mind. Tara had always worked hard to shield her daughter from the world's harshness, to give her a life filled with love and possibility despite their struggles. Yet, Meredith's cruel words had poked at every insecurity she had tried to bury. At the diner where Tara worked, her co-workers noticed something was off. Normally upbeat and quick to share a laugh despite the chaos of the busy restaurant, Tara now seemed distant, her smiles not reaching her eyes. Her best friend, Angie, who worked the register, finally cornered her during a rare lull. "All right, spill it," Angie said, leaning against the counter with a knowing look. "What's going on? You've been a million miles away all week." Tara hesitated, glancing around to make sure no customers were within earshot. Then, in a quiet voice, she recounted what had happened at the coffee shop. By the time she finished, Angie's eyes were wide, and her expression was a mix of outrage and disbelief. She said, "What?" Angie practically shouted, earning a few curious glances from the nearby booths. Lowering her voice, she continued, "Tara, that's awful. Who does she think she is?" "I don't know," Tara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But she wasn't wrong about one thing. I do feel like I'm barely holding it together most days." "Stop that," Angie said firmly, reaching out to grab Tara's hand. "You're one of the strongest people I know. Don't let some entitled woman who probably hasn't had a hard day in her life make you doubt that." Tara managed a small smile, but Angie wasn't done. "And what about that lawyer guy? Daniel, right? He sounds like he really had your back." "He did," Tara said, her cheeks flushing slightly at the memory. "He didn't have to get involved, but he did anyway. I don't even know how to thank him properly." "Maybe you'll get the chance," Angie said with a sly grin. "Guys like that don't just come and go. Something tells me he might show up again when you least expect it." Tara laughed softly, but her mind lingered on Angie's words. She didn't think she'd ever see Daniel again, but the idea of having an ally like him in her corner was comforting. Little did she know, the universe had other plans. Meanwhile, Meredith hadn't forgotten about the coffee shop incident either. While she pretended to move on, the public humiliation she'd faced left a bitter taste in her mouth. For someone like Meredith, whose image was everything, being called out in front of a room full of strangers felt like an unforgivable affront. She stewed over it for days, replaying the confrontation in her mind. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became, not just at Tara, but at Daniel too. Who did they think they were, challenging her like that? Meredith decided she wasn't going to let it go. She dug through social media, determined to find out more about the people who had dared to stand up to her. It didn't take long for her to find Tara's profile, a simple page filled with photos of her daughter, quotes about resilience, and the occasional snapshot of their modest but happy life. Scrolling through it only fueled Meredith's disdain. Playing the victim, Meredith muttered to herself, her lips curling into a sneer. But as she continued her search, she came across something that gave her pause. A post from Daniel's professional page had been shared by someone she followed, and his face stared back at her from the screen. Daniel Carter, she read aloud, her brow furrowing as she clicked on his profile. It didn't take long to piece together that he wasn't just any lawyer. He was well known in the legal community, with a reputation for taking on cases that involved advocating for those who couldn't fight for themselves. His page was filled with testimonials from clients, articles about his work, and photos of him at charity events. Meredith's jaw tightened as she scrolled further, her irritation growing. So, he thinks he's some kind of hero, she muttered. An idea began to form in her mind, one that would allow her to regain control of the narrative. She wasn't going to sit back and let herself be painted as the villain. Unbeknownst to Tara, Meredith had decided to escalate things. She began subtly spreading her version of the story to mutual acquaintances and online forums, painting herself as the victim of an overreaction. She even implied that Daniel had used his position of power to intimidate her. The rumors were vague but damaging enough to plant doubt in those who didn't know the full truth. One evening, Tara received an unexpected call from an unknown number. When she hesitantly answered, her heart sank as Meredith's voice came through the line. "I just wanted to let you know," Meredith said, her tone saccharine but with an unmistakable edge, "that I'm not the kind of person who lets things go quietly. You might want to be careful about the kind of people you associate with. Not everyone is as noble as they seem." Tara's hand tightened around the phone as she tried to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I'm not going to let you scare me." Meredith laughed softly. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just reminding you that actions have consequences. You'll see." As the call ended, Tara sat frozen, her mind racing. She didn't know what Meredith was planning, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The storm that had started in a quiet coffee shop was building, and Tara could feel it closing in. Daniel, too, began to hear whispers about Meredith's accusations, and while he initially dismissed them, it wasn't long before they started to gain traction. He knew he couldn't stay silent, especially if it meant Tara might get caught in the crossfire. It was time to confront Meredith once and for all, but as the stakes grew higher, so did the risks. Tara, Daniel, and Meredith were now locked in a battle that none of them could fully control. The lines between right and wrong blurred as the tension mounted, pulling everyone into a web of conflict that seemed destined to explode. Tara barely slept after the call from Meredith. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind spiraled into worst-case scenarios. She wasn't afraid of Meredith herself. She dealt with far tougher situations in her life, but the woman's veiled threats carried an unsettling weight. Tara had worked so hard to build a stable, if modest, life for her daughter, and the thought of someone tearing that down sent a chill through her. She didn't know what Meredith was capable of, but something about her tone during the call suggested she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted: control. The next morning, as Tara walked her daughter, Lily, to school, she tried to push her worries aside and focus on the moment. Lily was chattering happily about her class's upcoming field trip, her little face lighting up with excitement. But as they approached the school gates, Tara noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. It was the kind of car that practically screamed money, and while it wasn't unusual in their town, something about the way it sat idle felt off. She tightened her grip on Lily's hand, her eyes darting toward the car. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. Tara shook her head, telling herself she was being paranoid, but the uneasy feeling lingered as she kissed Lily goodbye and watched her disappear into the school building. By the time she arrived at work, the knot in her stomach had grown tighter. Angie immediately picked up on her tension as Tara tied on her apron and headed to her station. "You're jumpy today," Angie said, her voice laced with concern. "Something happen?" Tara hesitated, then sighed. "It's probably nothing, but I think Meredith is trying to scare me. She called me last night and basically said I should watch who I associate with. And this morning, there was this car parked outside Lily's school. It just felt wrong." Angie's expression darkened. "Tara, that's not nothing. You should tell someone." "Like who?" Tara asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "The police? What would I even say? That some rich woman doesn't like me and might be trying to intimidate me? They'd laugh me out of the station." Angie opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the diner's front door jingled open. Tara turned toward the sound and froze when she saw who had walked in. Daniel. He looked as polished as ever, his suit perfectly tailored and his presence commanding, but there was something different about him today, an urgency in his eyes that immediately put Tara on edge. He spotted her almost instantly and made his way over to the counter, his expression serious. "Tara," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Angie, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped back to give them space. Tara felt her heart rate spike as she gestured for Daniel to sit. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Daniel leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Meredith. She's not just spreading rumors anymore. She's trying to take things further." Tara's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She's filing a defamation claim against me," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "She's claiming I used my position to publicly humiliate her and damage her reputation. And from what I've gathered, she's planning to involve you in some way, probably to paint herself as the victim and you as part of a plot against her." Tara stared at him, disbelief washing over her. "Are you serious? That's insane." "I know," Daniel said, his tone calm but laced with tension. "But the way she's framing it, she's twisting the story to make it look like she was the one being attacked. And with the kind of resources she has, she could make this very messy for both of us." Tara's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic mess. She felt a surge of anger that Meredith would go to such lengths, anger that someone with so much privilege would use it to try to crush others just to satisfy her ego. But beneath the anger was fear. She didn't have the money or the connections to fight someone like Meredith. If this turned into a legal battle, what would happen to her and Lily? "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "First, we don't panic. I've dealt with people like Meredith before, and I know how to handle this. But you need to be prepared. She's going to dig into your life, looking for anything she can use against you." Tara swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She thought of her modest apartment, her long hours at the diner, the times she'd had to choose between paying a bill and buying groceries. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Still, she knew that wouldn't matter to someone like Meredith. "I'll help you," Daniel continued, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "But you have to trust me. This might get worse before it gets better." Tara nodded, her throat tight. "I trust you," she said, though the words felt heavy. She wanted to believe everything would be okay, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. As Daniel left the diner, promising to keep her updated, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm far bigger than either of them could have anticipated. And the sleek black car that she noticed idling across the street when she stepped outside only confirmed her fears. Meredith wasn't done yet. Tara could feel the walls closing in. The stress of Meredith's looming legal threats weighed on her constantly, and she found herself watching over her shoulder everywhere she went. The black car seemed to appear wherever she and Lily went to school drop-offs, the grocery store, even the park. She tried to convince herself it was just paranoia, but the sinking feeling in her gut told her otherwise. One afternoon, as Tara was walking home from work, her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "We need to meet. Something important came up. Can you come by my office?" Tara's heart skipped a beat. Daniel's messages were always calm and measured, but this one carried an urgency that unsettled her. She quickly texted back, agreeing to meet him after picking up Lily. When she arrived at Daniel's office, the atmosphere felt different. Daniel was waiting for her in the lobby, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something sharper, focused and intense. He ushered her into his office, closing the door firmly behind them. "I think we've got her," Daniel said, skipping any preamble. Tara blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Daniel handed her a stack of papers and pointed to a specific page. "Meredith's been sloppy. While she's been trying to frame you and me as the aggressors, she left a trail of her own actions, emails, messages, and even private investigators she hired to follow you. She crossed a line, and we have proof." Tara's hands trembled slightly as she scanned the documents. Her stomach churned at the idea of being followed, of her every move being monitored. But as she read through the evidence, a spark of hope ignited in her chest. "So we can fight this?" she asked, her voice tinged with both fear and relief. Daniel nodded. "Not just fight it, win. This isn't just a case of defamation anymore. Meredith's actions constitute harassment, and she's violated several privacy laws. If we play this right, she'll be the one facing legal consequences." Tara felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, and disbelief all at once. But before she could fully process the news, Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's her lawyer," he said, answering the call. Tara watched as his expression shifted, his jaw tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he turned back to Tara, his face grave. "Meredith knows we've got the upper hand. Her lawyer's proposing a settlement. They're offering to drop everything if we agree to keep this quiet." Tara's eyes widened. "Quiet? After everything she's done?" Daniel sighed. "I know. It's infuriating, but it might be the quickest way to put this behind you. The question is, do you want to take it?" Tara sat in silence, her mind racing. On one hand, the idea of moving on without the weight of a legal battle was tempting. But on the other hand, letting Meredith walk away without facing real consequences felt wrong. She thought of Lily, of the example she wanted to set for her daughter. "I don't want to let her win," Tara said finally, her voice firm. "She needs to be held accountable." Daniel nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Then that's what we'll do." The next week was a blur of meetings and preparation. Daniel filed a countersuit on Tara's behalf, alleging harassment and invasion of privacy. The news spread quickly, and for the first time, Meredith found herself on the defensive. The polished facade she'd maintained began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny, and as the court date approached, her confidence seemed to waver. On the day of the hearing, Tara sat beside Daniel in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Meredith entered with her legal team, her expression icy but strained. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable, she looked vulnerable. Daniel presented their case with precision and poise, laying out the evidence of Meredith's actions in a way that left no room for doubt. Emails detailing her plans to discredit Tara, invoices for private investigators, and even surveillance photos were brought to light. By the time Daniel finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of Meredith's actions clear to everyone present. When Meredith's lawyer rose to speak, he seemed to fumble, unable to refute the damning evidence. And then, to everyone's surprise, Meredith herself stood up. "I'd like to speak," she said, her voice shaky but determined. The judge allowed it, and Meredith took a deep breath before addressing the court. I made mistakes," she said, her voice wavering. "I let my anger get the best of me, and I went too far. I never intended for things to spiral like this, but I can see now that I was wrong." Tara watched, stunned, as Meredith's carefully constructed image unraveled. For a moment, she wondered if the apology was genuine or simply a desperate attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left. In the end, the court ruled in Tara's favor, ordering Meredith to pay damages and issue a formal apology. As they left the courtroom, Tara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. But just as Tara was beginning to feel a sense of closure, Daniel pulled her aside. "There's one more thing," he said, his tone serious. "While we were digging into Meredith's actions, we uncovered something unexpected. Something about her past that might explain why she targeted you in the first place." Tara frowned, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "It turns out you and Meredith have more in common than you think. Years ago, before she became the woman you know now, she was in a situation not unlike yours, a single mom struggling to make ends meet. She spent her whole life running from that version of herself, and when she saw you, it brought it all back. Her anger wasn't just about you, it was about her own insecurities." Tara stared at him, stunned. She didn't know what to say. The revelation didn't excuse Meredith's actions, but it added a layer of complexity to a woman she had seen only as a villain. As Tara walked away that day, holding Lily's hand tightly, she couldn't help but reflect on how life had a way of connecting people in the most unexpected ways. Justice had been served, but the journey had taught her something even more valuable: strength, compassion, and the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. As Tara and Lily walked home that evening, the winter air felt sharper against her cheeks, but Tara didn't mind. There was a calmness settling over her, one she hadn't felt in weeks. The courtroom victory was still fresh in her mind, but it wasn't just the outcome that stayed with her, it was everything that had led her there. For so long, she'd felt powerless against the tides of life, always struggling to stay afloat. But this time, she'd stood her ground, and the world hadn't crumbled beneath her feet. She glanced down at Lily, who was happily skipping along beside her, clutching a small snow globe they'd picked up on their way home. "Mommy," Lily said suddenly, looking up at her. "Are you happy now?" Tara paused for a moment, considering the question. Happy wasn't quite the word she would have chosen. Relieved, yes. Exhausted, definitely. But there was something else there too, something lighter. Maybe it was hope. "I think I am, sweetheart," Tara said, smiling softly. "I think things are finally looking up." That night, after Lily was tucked into bed, Tara sat on the couch with a mug of tea, replaying the events of the past few months. Meredith's apology in court had been unexpected, and while Tara wasn't sure she fully forgave her, she couldn't deny it had given her closure. Knowing what Daniel had revealed about Meredith's past only deepened her understanding of why the woman had acted the way she did. It didn't excuse the pain Meredith had caused, but it reminded Tara that everyone carried their own struggles, even if they weren't visible on the surface. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, life began to return to normal. Tara returned to her shifts at the diner, where Angie welcomed her back with open arms and an endless stream of gossip to catch up on. The black car that had once felt like a shadow over her life was gone, and the whispers of Meredith's actions faded as the news cycle moved on. But not everything went back to the way it had been. Daniel remained a presence in Tara's life, checking in often to make sure she was doing okay. At first, Tara had been hesitant to let him in. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, and the idea of trusting someone again felt foreign. But Daniel was patient, and over time, Tara found herself looking forward to his calls and the occasional coffee they shared when their schedules aligned. One afternoon, as they sat in the same coffee shop where everything had started, Tara finally asked him something that had been on her mind. "Why did you step in that day?" she asked, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "You didn't know me, and you didn't have to get involved. So why did you?" Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "I've spent my career fighting for people who don't always have the resources to fight for themselves. And that day, I saw someone who deserved to be stood up for. It wasn't about winning or making a point, it was about doing what was fair." Tara studied him for a moment, his words sinking in. She realized then how rare it was to meet someone who truly believed in justice, not just in theory but in action. And as she looked at him, she felt a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, something that felt a little like trust. Months later, Tara received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Meredith. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside was a handwritten note, surprisingly short and to the point. Tara, I wanted to say thank you. Facing the consequences of my actions wasn't easy, but it forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding for a long time. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I hope you and your daughter find happiness, and I hope one day I can learn to do the same. Meredith. Tara read the note twice before folding it carefully and tucking it away. It wasn't the grand gesture she might have imagined, but it felt genuine, and that was enough. She didn't need to dwell on Meredith's past or her struggles. That was her journey to navigate. For Tara, the focus was on moving forward. As the seasons changed, Tara found herself embracing the small joys of life with a newfound appreciation. She and Lily planted flowers in their tiny garden, went on weekend hikes, and spent quiet evenings reading together. There were still challenges, bills to pay, long shifts to endure, but Tara faced them with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. One crisp spring morning, as Tara and Lily walked to the park, Lily tugged at her hand. "Mommy," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Look! It's Mr. Daniel." Tara turned to see Daniel standing by a bench, waving at them with a warm smile. He held a small bag in his hand, which he held out as they approached.